Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the CTRJJ's webinar, Introduction to Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals. And this is a specific webinar that has been curated and tailored for the role of forensic evaluators. And I would like to introduce myself. I'm Keith Cruz. I am the co-director of the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, and I will be moderating or facilitating the webinar today. For those of you who are not familiar with the CTRJJ, we are a training and technical assistance center affiliated with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network with funding through SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health and Services Administration. The mission of the CTRJJ is to support a comprehensive framework for developing, adopting, implementing, and sustaining evidence-based trauma-informed services for youth who are in or are at risk for youth justice system involvement, while also supporting families and also by extension, really thinking about ways of supporting staff who are working to infuse and to deliver these services with youth and families as well. A few housekeeping and reminders is we are in webinar format. And so as we move through the material today, please feel free to submit any questions to Dr. Carrig, our presenter, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on the toolbar. And with the time that's left, Patricia will make sure to address as many questions as possible. As you might have noticed that the webinar today is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email from the CTRJJ when the webinar recording has been made available on the CTRJJ YouTube channel. At the end of the presentation today, there will also be a notification of a certificate of attendance that will be made available through the CTRJJ website. There will be some instructions that we will share for you at the end of the webinar today. That certificate is available for download. It is not established for either CLE or CE credits for lawyers or mental health professionals, but we know that many people prefer to have some documentation of attendance as well. And what I'd like to just transition now is a quick introduction to our speaker, Dr. Patricia Carrig, who's a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Utah. She is a longstanding faculty member of the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice. For those of us who have known her work professionally for many years, her research focuses on understanding the developmental processes and the linkage points between childhood traumatic event exposure and trauma reactions to adolescent justice system involvement, and also creating pathways for their recovery and resilience. And through the CTRJJ, she's contributed to many CTRJJ efforts in helping to develop and disseminate evidence-based trauma-informed practices. And she is the primary author of the curriculum and the training program that she will be talking about today, Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals. And so with that, I will turn this over to Patricia for us to start into the content for today's webinar. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, Keith. Whoops, I'm jumping ahead. This next slide gives you a bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing together in the next hour. We'll talk about what we mean by secondary traumatic stress, and then how we can go beyond a self-care framework to think of this in terms of enhancing our resilience. And then I'll describe to you the components of the curriculum I've developed called Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals. And along the way, we'll do a skill building exercise together. But I want to start today the way I always start these presentations because it grounds me in my purpose in doing this work. And this comes from several years ago when, as part of my work with the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, I was doing trainings on trauma-informed care with different staff in the juvenile justice system. And after one workshop with a group of probation officers down in Provo, Utah, a gentleman who'd been sitting quietly throughout raised his hand and said, You've convinced me that it's important for us to know if the youth we're working with have experienced trauma, but I don't want to be the one to do that work. And I was taken aback and I asked him, tell me more about what you mean by that. And he said, because if a youth I was working with told me that any of those terrible things had happened to them, I wouldn't know what to say. And I thought to myself, that makes perfect sense. You've been trained as a probation officer. You haven't been trained in how to respond in helpful ways to youth's disclosures of trauma. And perhaps even more importantly, you haven't been trained in how to cope with the difficult thoughts and feelings that can arise when we learn about others' traumas. So I thought to myself, something more is needed. And I set out on a journey of discovery to learn as much as I could about what we know about how we're affected by others' traumas and what is helpful in the aftermath. And I found some wonderful resources that I'll share with you today, but I also saw some gaps. And the other thing that really struck me is as I began talking about this with different constituents in the justice system, um, often people who had been received mental health training came up to me afterwards and said, you know, we haven't received specialized training in this either. So the need is there as well. So, who in the juvenile justice system is exposed to others' traumas? As I've been learning through the listening sessions I've been conducting over the past few months, essentially all of us, including forensic evaluators, probation officers, attorneys, judges, court staff, detention workers, mental health providers in the forensic system, and even researchers who study topics related to juvenile justice and trauma. The ways in which individuals encounter secondary traumatic stress depends on the role they play, but common themes that I've been hearing about include reading trauma-filled case histories, doing trauma history screenings, hearing trauma disclosures, viewing graphic evidence, which we'll talk a lot about today, interacting with distressed youth and their family members, and listening to their colleagues talk about their cases. And in particular, those who do their work within institutional settings or go into evaluees' homes are not only exposed to stories about things that happened in the past, but can also be exposed to sensory inputs, sights and sounds and smells that tell them in a very immediate and visceral way something bad has happened here. So why should we be concerned about exposure to other people's traumas? In fact, exposure to others' traumas has a real impact on us. As Tim Wires put it so powerfully, you don't have to be shot to go through a shooting. Exposure to others' traumas, in fact, is a potential source of trauma for us. Now, it's interesting to consider that that wasn't always understood to be the case. The long-standing definition of trauma in criterion A for the diagnosis of PTSD is exposure to actual or threatened death or injury or violence through directly experiencing it ourselves, witnessing it in person, or learning that it's happened to a loved one. And this we can term primary trauma. But it wasn't until the definition was revised in the DSM-5 that it included repeated or extreme exposure to the aversive details of traumatic events that others have experienced. And the definition goes on to specify, in particular, people who are required to be exposed to this kind of information as part of their work. So this we can refer to as secondary trauma exposure and the aftermath as secondary traumatic stress. So if this is true, It means that addressing secondary traumatic stress is a professional competency for those whose work involves contact with traumatized individuals or trauma-related material. So beyond doing self-care when we go home at the end of the day, having the skills to recognize our own STS reactions, to prevent them, and to respond are crucial tools that we all need in our professional toolkits. But having said that, even though I'm talking about STS in the context of a diagnosis, having a reaction to exposure to others' traumas is not a sign of pathology. It's only human. PTSD and STS come into play when those reactions cause us significant distress and interfere with our ability to function. After all, as Rachel Raymond puts it, expecting that we can be exposed to trauma-related information every day in our work lives without being affected is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to wade through water without getting wet. So before I go further, I want to pause and talk about the different terms that are used in this literature. They're sometimes talked about as though they are interchangeable, other times talked about as though they're very discrete and independent. I actually think of these as each being one dimension of a multidimensional construct. So a common term we hear is burnout, which refers to feelings of emotional exhaustion and alienation and ineffectiveness that can come about when we feel powerless and unappreciated in the work we do. And certainly burnout can happen in the context of secondary trauma exposure. But what's important to note about burnout is that it's not specific to trauma exposure. The person who flips burgers at Burger King can experience burnout if they feel powerless and unappreciated. Another term that is used is compassion fatigue. And this captures well that feeling of being emotionally spent by caring for others without being able to replenish our own reserves. We've gone to the well once too often, and the well is dry. But this is a problematic term, and I want to explain to you why I say that. To illustrate this, there's a wonderful animated film that Brene Brown created to illustrate the difference between empathy and sympathy. And in this film, the sad red fox has climbed down into the well of despair. Other animals come by and offer sympathy. Hey, looks rough. Hope day's better tomorrow. But this empathic bear comes down into the well and shares the fox's emotional state. The fox appreciates this. The fox feels understood and no longer so alone. But if you look at this image, you see black clouds of despair over both of their heads. And you need to wonder what's going to happen to this poor bear. So if empathy is sharing another person's feeling state, compassion is actually something different. In compassion, we recognize that another person is suffering or struggling, and we want to help. And in addition, when we are engaging in compassionate interactions in the context of a supportive social ecology, we're not having to do that alone. We've all got one another's backs. So I think rather than compassion fatigue, actually a better term for this is empathy fatigue, because it's the empathy that is draining. Another term that is used is vicarious trauma. And I think this does a good job of getting at the aspect of this experience that can change our own thoughts and feelings, as we engage empathically with a traumatized person, our own worldview and belief system can be affected. And one of the reasons why I think this is such a valuable construct is it's related to another one more recently identified, which is moral injury. So let's take a deeper dive into that. According to Brett Litz and his colleagues, moral injury refers to perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress our own deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. This is a construct that was first identified in military personnel who came back from service troubled by things that they had needed to do or that they had seen done. But in recent years, the construct has been applied to a wide variety of different populations, including in my lab, youth in the justice system. They have no difficulty understanding this and recognizing that there are things that they have done, been forced to do, failed to do, or witnessed that are deeply troubling to them. But of all the dimensions of moral injury we've studied, the one we have found is most impactful is betrayal. When somebody, a youth, should have been able to turn to for protection and care, did something that they feel is very wrong. And I can't say what the outcome will be, but for any of you who are interested in how this construct can be applied to forensic work, there's a special issue of the Journal of Forensic Sciences on vicarious trauma that had a call for papers recently. And there's one that I've submitted that really does a deep dive on thinking about the impact of forensic science work from a moral injury perspective. So then we come to the last term, secondary traumatic stress, which is in the formal definition would be the presence of any of the symptoms that are associated with PTSD that result from indirect exposure to others' traumas. These include unwanted thoughts and images, strong desire to avoid reminders of the trauma, changes in our own thoughts and feelings, and feeling hyper aroused. And because I think of this as being at the extreme end of a continuum and including dimensions of the other constructs, it's the sort of overarching term that I've been using. The other reason why I think these constructs are valuable is that there can also be the opposite. Just as there can be so-called compassion fatigue, or better said, empathy fatigue, we can also experience compassion satisfaction when we feel competent at our work, have positive relationships with our colleagues, and have a conviction that our work is making a meaningful difference. And by the same token, just as there can be vicarious trauma, there's also the potential for vicarious resilience, the uplift that we get from witnessing another person's recovery from trauma. We also know from research some of the risk and protective factors for secondary traumatic stress. An isolative work environment is one, whereas connection with colleagues is protective. The sheer volume of trauma exposure enhances the risk, whereas support and debriefing in helpful ways, as we'll talk about, can be protective. Some research shows that people with high levels of empathy are more vulnerable, whereas compassion satisfaction has been empirically demonstrated to reduce STS. An important one is when people experience shame about having STS reactions, whereas openness and acknowledgement, and here I'd actually add self-compassion, are protective. Research also shows that coming into this work with one's own history of exposure to adversity and trauma can increase vulnerability, but that's not absolute. Having achieved resolution and made meaning of those experiences erases the link. And then the last thing on this table is not something that we yet have empirical evidence for, but I'm hoping to gather it because this is my hypothesis that going into this work with a lack of training and preparation for dealing with exposure to trauma, like that probation officer I described at the beginning, increases vulnerability. Whereas walking into a situation knowing that we have the right tools in our toolkits, I believe will be protective. So, what does secondary traumatic stress look like? Well, it depends on who you ask. But one of the resources I found that I really appreciated was a book by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky entitled Trauma Stewardship. And she makes the point that if we are going to work with others who've experienced trauma, we need to be not only good stewards or caretakers of their well-being, we also need to be good stewards and caretakers of our own capacity to be helpful. One of the things I love about her book is her use of humor. And I think humor is very powerful because it allows us to look at difficult things in a way that gentles them. She received permission to reproduce a number of cartoons, most of them from the New Yorker magazine, and so I got permission to share them with you as well. So let's take a look. What can STS look like? One sign is feelings of helplessness and low self-efficacy. And although I think this is a very funny cartoon, I'm going to take exception to it a little bit later in this talk. Working as hard as we can, but feeling like we're never doing enough. We're just howling at the moon. That feeling of hypervigilance, of being always on and barking at everything. Loss of pleasure in life. A big one that I see is cynicism, when people realize they have lost the sense of meaning and purpose that brought them in to this work in the first place. And on the other extreme, that feeling of being trapped by our own indispensability, of being the only one who can put out this forest fire. And as I mentioned, while these cartoons have humor, they also contain elements of truth. So in her book, Vandernoot-Lipsky also gives quotes from actual people who have experienced these things. So, for example, here is an animal rescue worker who talks about even though they save lives every day, they can only think about the lives they've failed to save, which feels like a personal failure. And here a community organizer talks about just getting through the day, coming home, and going round and round the dial, and that's all life has to offer. Here, a domestic violence advocate talks about not even being able to take pleasure in looking at a friend's wedding album without the intrusive thought coming to mind of, I wonder when the domestic violence is going to start. And here, an attorney for death row inmates says, it's not a feeling that I can never do enough. It's the reality. If I don't do it, it doesn't get done, and somebody could die. So signs of secondary traumatic stress may be physical exhaustion, trouble sleeping or oversleeping, stress-related headaches, backaches, and stomach aches, and even getting sick more often as our immune system is affected. They may be behavioral, including increased substance use or other kinds of addictive behaviors, whether those are shopping, gambling, social media, or the one that I see most often amongst juvenile justice professionals, workaholism. Other signs may be anger and irritability, socially isolating, and what Francoise Mathieu calls the silencing response, shutting other people down, communicating in all sorts of ways. I'm full up to here, and I can't give you any more. The signs may also be emotional. Psychological, emotional exhaustion, feelings of ineffectiveness, reduced empathy and cynicism, a changed worldview when moral injury has affected us, any of the symptoms associated with PTSD. And here we also see some dramatic individual differences. Some people will report becoming overly sensitive to anything that is a reminder of the kind of work they do. They can no longer enjoy certain kinds of books or movies, where other people talk about seeming to be driven to seek out that kind of stimulation and information. The signs also may be professional, an overburdened sense of responsibility, that feeling of being always on, or the opposite, avoiding work, resenting the demands of the workday, difficulty making decisions, and overall difficulty separating work from personal life. And though I've been talking about these as separate domains, of course, they tend to co-occur and interact with one another. So I mentioned before these listening sessions that I've been conducting with a number of different constituents of individuals whose work involves juvenile justice. And I have been asking them to share with me, how do you encounter secondary traumatic stress, and how do you see it affecting you and the people around you? So, doing this with forensic evaluators was particularly poignant for me. I got to talk with some of my very close colleagues, and also to interview myself, because this is part of the work that I do. So, what have forensic evaluators told me about STS in their experience? One said, I work with people who have PTSD all the time, but this doesn't feel like PTSD. This is a cumulative burden of day after day, year after year, one set of terrible images piled on another. Another said, I try to prepare myself for what I'm about to see, but sometimes the discovery is disorganized and I open an unlabeled file and there's something awful in it and I can't unsee it. But then again, preparing for it beforehand doesn't really do the job either. A number of people talked about this phenomenon, and this is in the literature that I'll mention in a minute too. The idea of gallows humor. This is very understood to be a common coping strategy amongst those who do forensic work. As one put it, this kind of humor is a bonding between us. We all get it. And shows that we're hardened, and we wear that as a badge of honor. But actually, it doesn't help. Another said that we don't talk about this. We don't talk about how vulnerable and stressed we feel. We don't talk about how we put it behind ourselves at the end of the day. Another really resonated with this idea of moral injury, that sometimes all the work we do makes no real difference to the legal outcome. This can lead to a sense of disillusionment, like we're just a cog in the machine. I also asked people to, I'm sorry, and then another mentioned that what really had an impact for them was that experience of looking at a youth's face while they give testimony and thinking about what that must be like for the youth to be in a room full of adults trotting out their most painful experiences. So I also asked people to share with me what does help. I'll pull these up because the animation is wonky. A number of people said that it's hard to find anyone to talk to. No one else gets this. And there's a lot of value in finding a colleague, sometimes somebody who's not in the profession, but adjacent enough that they can understand. And another thing I really appreciated was this idea of a mutual system of social support, not just feeling like I'm going to somebody for support, but I'm also granting support to my colleague as well. Another mention keeping in mind that even if we don't see a good outcome in the legal system, we might have done some good. For example, bearing witness as a youth told their story might have been an impactful, positive experience for them. Another mentioned that it was important for them to keep in mind how stressed judges are and how much vicarious trauma they've experienced to help them stay compassionate for some of the things that happen in the courtroom that can be quite challenging. So is this news? Does nobody know about this? I know this slide is too tiny for you to actually read, but the slides will be available to you afterwards. This is just intended to illustrate how many articles I found that talked about forensic evaluators or those doing related work. So this is something that people have some notion about, and clearly is something that needs to be addressed. For example, a court system in Australia was sued for failing to prevent the harms of secondary traumatic stress exposure on court staff, and the suit was successful. The finding was that they were liable for failing to provide a safe workplace by not protecting judicial officers from the harms of what they were calling vicarious trauma exposure. They went on to say that there is a duty of care that employers have when exposure of an employee to trauma is inherent in their work. So, if we are going to address STS, how do we do so? Well, when I turned to the literature, what I found almost universally was a recommendation for self-care. You can see here a veritable sea of self-care. And there's some helpful resources. There are a number of measures that have been developed to allow people to do a check-in on whether they are using effective self-care, such as taking time off when it's granted, engaging in relaxing activities, eating healthy food, retaining social connections. But what happens when stressed and busy people come home at the end of the workday? Too often, the strategies we turn to are not things that are going to be helpful to us in the long run. But even more than that, there's some evidence that self-care has limitations. For example, one study that I found really striking followed a group of trauma professionals who participated in trainings focused on self-care. And what they found is that these trainings didn't actually increase the amount of time people spent in self-care activities. Not surprising, we don't always do the things that we know are good for us. But what was more surprising is the amount of time spent in self-care was not associated with lower secondary traumatic stress. Well, why might this be the case? There are a number of potential reasons, but one I think is worth considering is that most suggested self-care activities are things for us to do at home at the end of the day. So that means they're taking place long after secondary exposure and divorced from the workplace. Instead, I'd argue we need strategies that we can use in the moment, here and now, when we're being exposed to others' traumas. And we also need proactive strategies we can use in anticipation of exposures. And importantly, we need strategies that are integrated in our workplace environments, just as secondary traumatic stress exposure is a part of our workplace environment. Another limitation of self-care is that these worksheets aren't always developed with an eye toward thinking about cultural dimensions and differences. Our cultural backgrounds influence how we understand what is disrupted in ourselves and our relations with others when we experience trauma, how we encode and interpret those experiences, and importantly, culture can influence how we think about the processes that will lead to recovery and healing. And those may not be the things that are listed on self-care inventories. So if we will look for an alternative to self-care, one possibility is to consider the idea of resilience. But what do we mean by that? When researchers first started studying resilience, they talked about it as though there were some people who were just armor plated. They could walk through fire without getting burned. They were impervious to all adversity. But as the research continued, we realized that that doesn't really capture resilience. People who are resilient are affected by their experiences. And that's just as well because wearing a suit of armor would be hot and heavy and uncomfortable. I also don't think that resilience is captured well by the idea that we could put on a psychological hazmat suit that would isolate us from the contagions around us. In fact, having reactions and emotions to our work is not only just human. Our emotions are a valuable tool because they tell us when there's something that needs attending to. So, an alternative way of thinking about resilience is that it means adapting in the face of challenges while we may still be affected by our experiences. It's also not an all or nothing phenomenon. We can be resilient in some ways, even if we're struggling in others. And it's also not a matter of our own true grit. Resilience isn't a personality trait, although there may be characteristics that we have that contribute to resilience. Instead, it's made up of strengths and protective factors in multiple domains. And one model I think really captures this nicely is the resilience portfolio model that John Gritch and Sherry Hamby and their colleagues developed. And they talk about an emotional dimension to resilience, our capacity to be aware of our emotions, to modulate them, and to cope with them with honesty and humility. There's also a cognitive dimension, our ability to make meaning of our experiences, to retain a sense of purpose and connection to our values. And there's an interpersonal dimension, our capacity to be generative, to have compassion toward others and ourselves, and to be connected to our sources of support and sense of community. So, what enables us to be resilient when we encounter secondary traumatic stress? I would argue that just like exposure to primary trauma, secondary traumatic stress dysregulates us physically, emotionally, cognitively, and maybe even morally. And it causes us to experience as if it's happening in the present something that has happened in the past. And if that's true, the strategies that will protect us will be those that reestablish our balance, ground us in the present, dispel unhelpful interpretations, and reconnect us to our strengths and sources of support. So, with that idea of resilience in mind, I developed this curriculum, Resilience for Trauma-Informed Professionals, and there's an article that describes more of the conceptual underpinnings. But I thought what would be more helpful to introduce you to the model is to walk you through each of the elements as they're organized around the stages of our encounters with secondary traumatic stress. And I'll go through each of these in more detail, but basically, first, can we think preventatively? Are there things we can do to limit unnecessary exposures? Are there things we can do in anticipation prior to exposure that enhances our skills? And then what I found most missing from the workbooks and trainings that I explored, what can we do in the moment when we are being exposed to graphic material or horrific stories? And then what can we do after exposure to monitor how we are doing and to recover in the aftermath? So let me talk a little bit about how we flesh this out. And what I'll be describing are pages that come from the workbook that I created to accompany the training. So first, when we think about prevention, one possibility is there may be some exposures to other people's traumas that aren't, in fact, necessary to people's work. This is most relevant for juvenile justice staff in facilities, for example, who are trying to identify youth who may have post-traumatic stress reactions so that they can be prepared to help them in the aftermath. What we tend to do is to identify those youth through doing a trauma history screening, which inadvertently can expose the staff member to distressing information. An alternative is to think of if we're trying to identify people who are experiencing post-traumatic stress in the present, maybe that's what we need to ask about rather than the details of what happened to them in the past. So one of the tools we created for staff to do that is the safety plan or triggers and coping strategies, and it has three parts. One invites youth to identify what might be triggers for you, whether that's being left alone or feeling crowded. What might show us that you have been triggered? Would it be yelling and cursing or getting extremely quiet? And then what are the signs that would be helpful to you? Would you want somebody to sit down with you and interact with you, or would you want people to give you five and let you chill? Another way we can be preventative is by containing the contagion. Seeking social support from our colleagues and debriefing can be enormously helpful. But that comes with a caveat that there's the potential that when we debrief, we are passing on the secondary traumatic stress to our colleagues. So the question is, can we benefit from getting support from others without necessarily sharing every graphic detail? And if we're on the receiving end of somebody else's debrief, is there a gentle and supportive way we can steer them from sharing too much information? So this is a technique called limited impact debriefing that focuses on first taking a moment to reflect on what we need. Do we need to describe something that is very graphic? And then asking the other person if this is a time that is good for them, requesting consent and waiting for the other person to acknowledge, yes, this is something that I'm prepared to hear, or giving them an opportunity to say, I'm having a really rough time. I wonder if we could find somebody who would be available. And then disclosing in a thoughtful and careful way that focuses on the impact on you of what you have heard rather than the gruesome details of the trauma. Or if we are in a situation where we need to talk about exactly what we have heard or what we have seen, identifying somebody who has the training and the preparedness to be on the receiving end of our debrief. We also talk about how even after a helpful debrief, there are things that might keep us stuck in a trauma story. And here we talk about the role of appraisals, interpretations, about the event, about what it means about ourselves and the world around us, and how those appraisals can affect how we feel, think, and behave, and be associated with post-traumatic stress or secondary traumatic stress, or be helpful and associated with resilience. So I'm going to jump ahead next to the third stage of the encounter. What can we do in the moment when we are viewing or hearing something that is very distressing? I took a page from that probation officer who said, I wouldn't know what to say. And so one of the worksheets in the workbook talks exactly about that. What is helpful for us to say when we hear a trauma disclosure, and what would not be helpful? We also talk in a very straightforward way about what people often think of as the worst case scenario, that somebody may have a triggered reaction in our presence. What would we do and what would we say? And in all of these strategies, we're keeping an eye on individual differences that what will be helpful for one person may not be what's helpful for another. Then we also talk about what we can do in the aftermath of secondary trauma exposure to recover our resilience. And the first thing is we need to know if we have been affected by our work. One very helpful tool to do that is the ProQual, the Professional Quality of Life Scale. It's free online, and you can plug in your responses and get an immediate readout on your level of burnout, secondary traumatic stress, and compassion satisfaction. So this is very helpful, but a limitation, I would say, is that the signs of secondary traumatic stress that are on this scale may not quite capture the ways in which you demonstrate secondary traumatic stress. So an alternative is to develop your own personal early warning system. So let's take a bit of a deep dive into this RTIP skill. This technique is called the dosimeter, and it's named after the badge an X-ray tech tells. It's a little meter that tells them if they have been exposed to a toxic dose of X-rays. If we had a meter we could wear to detect if we've been exposed to excess secondary traumatic stress, that would be helpful, but no such thing has been created. So we can develop our own. And this asks us to identify first, what are we like when we're in our green zone? What do we look like when we are calm, when we're clear thinking, and at our best? And then what do we look like when we're in our yellow zone, when we're beginning to be affected by the work we do. And why is the yellow zone so important to recognize? Because any intervention techniques we do are going to be more effective when we implement them in our yellow zone than if we're already in the red zone and STS has gotten the better of us. So when people do this, I encourage them to think about doing it in two different contexts. What are the signs you experience most at work? And then what are the signs you bring home most often? Because those can be very different. Many of the professionals I've talked with have said that they're consummate professionals and nobody knows if they're struggling at work because they do their work effectively. But it's when they let their hair down at the end of the day that their family and loved ones will notice things. So that brings me to the other fine-tuning point is when I ask people who is the best source of information about your signs in these three zones, often people's first response is me, I know myself best. And that may be true, but it's also possible that there are things that others recognize that you may not be aware of. So, for example, I have a colleague who told me, I can always tell when your work is beginning to get the better of you. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, because you lose your sense of humor. You don't laugh at my jokes anymore. And I was completely unaware of that. I just thought sometimes she's not really very funny. But she was picking up on something that I would not have recognized. The other benefit to talking about this with somebody who knows you and whom you trust is that they can also become accountability buddies. They can give you a nudge if they notice any of your signs and also be accountable with you for working on this and paying attention to your dosimeter. So this dosimeter is part of a larger STS protection toolkit that involves knowing the signs that you've been affected, having a regular check-in time, and being very explicit about when and where and with whom you're going to do that, having identified strategies that are helpful for you in anticipation of secondary exposures, the skills that help you during exposures. And then after exposures, what are the things that are restorative and allow you to recharge rather than just to unplug? And then what in the longer term allows you to nurture your sense of compassion, satisfaction in the work you do. We also don't forget about that research that said people trained in self-care don't utilize self-care. So we talk about the things that can get in the way, including just that term self-care makes it sound like this is something that's self-oriented and selfish. But we actually will do our best work and be most effective when we're clear thinking and calm and healthy. Saknata put it really bluntly. We have an obligation to our clients, as well as ourselves, our colleagues, and our loved ones, not to be damaged by the work you do. And as Robin Tenner put it, STS hurts you and it hurts your family. We talk about not using the tools and not practicing what we preach. Just coming to trainings like this and leaving it behind when you go back to work is going to be as effective, as Francoise Mathieu puts it, as trying to fix your car's flat tire by reading the owner's manual. I want to emphasize here that although there are things that individuals can do There's a personal investment we can make in nurturing our effective self-care and resilience strategies. There are professional skills that we can learn by coming to training such as this. But an essential part of addressing STS includes the organization and the efforts that it puts into acknowledging that STS is an occupational hazard of this work, in reducing risks wherever possible, and in responding to staff who've been affected. So here we are back up at that prior to exposure stage and how we can create a social ecology of mutual awareness and support around STS. So I think of organizational strategies as involving preventing whenever possible, monitoring staff well-being, and then responding to staff who've been affected, including finding ways that are non-stigmatizing for people to access the assistance they might need. Because as I mentioned, this is a funny slide, but it's wrong. Seeking therapy can be an act of high self-efficacy. As an example of that, I had a training with a group that was in a managed care, behavioral health care setting, tasks with doing the follow-up evaluations when things went wrong. And this was a group that had to watch film, for example, of very distressing incidents. And we felt like the RTIP strategies could be useful, but weren't explicitly addressed in the workbook. And so I created 2 new tools for the workbook. And the one I started with is what organizations can do to prepare and support staff who are going to do this difficult work. And then there's also a tool for the staff themselves. So here are some wonderful resources on organizational strategies for addressing STS. I've also provided a slide with some of my favorite resources on resilience and recovery. There's some resources that are specific to justice-related organizations. But at this point, I want to invite any questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. There was a comment in the Q&A that I think is really apt for all of us and across different roles, including forensic evaluators. But it's, how do you address or help people in this work that feel undervalued or underpaid after the requirements of putting so much, time and energy, emotional and physical, and that level of effort that we have to do as a group in order to be present for the people that we're working with. And maybe this bumps up against that moral injury component that you were mentioning. That's the connection that I was making in looking at this question, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that's a wonderful question and such an important issue. One of the reasons why some individuals who study moral injury think that standard trauma treatments aren't appropriate is that something like cognitive processing therapy tends to presume that people's appraisals are inaccurate or unhelpful. And moral injury says your appraisals may be right on the money. It may absolutely be true that you are underpaid and underappreciated, and the fact that you are expected to do this work without appropriate compensation is deeply wrong, and that you aren't wrong to feel that way. There's a wonderful book by I'm going to mangle her name, but it's on the list of references that I gave. Lakshmi Pujai, I think is her name, called Real Self-Care. And one of the arguments she makes is this isn't about bubble baths and getting pedicures. This is about acknowledging what is wrong in the world around us and freeing up the energy to take action to right those wrongs. And I really appreciated her emphasis on the fact that our reality may be what needs to be changed, not us.
Yeah, no, Patricia, that's great. And I think as we're wrapping up today, a real practical but very important question is where can attendees find the RTIP workbook? And noting is that offering this as like an in-service theme within an agency or colleague, but any reflections on that?
Yeah, I created the workbook to accompany the training. It's not a standalone kind of thing. And so that's how people get the workbook is by having me come and work through it with them. And then they carry it away with them.
Yeah. And so contacting Patricia at her email address, I will go back to that real quickly, would be a way to, engage directly with Dr. Carrick about the possibility of training. One of the things that I would encourage as we wrap up today is to also consider signing up for the CTRJJ mailing list, which you could access through this QR code here as well. Is the CTRJJ is planning in the next year of our grant the opportunity for agencies to receive, training support directly through our grant funding in the RTIPA curriculum, which would be another way of providing that access point. And so by signing up for the CTRJJ mailing list, you would receive some notifications as we move into our next grant year around that as a possibility. I want to thank Patricia for her wonderful presentation today. And for those of you who would like access points to the certificate, you can take a quick snap here as well, or reach out to us and we'll provide you the instructions for how to download the certificate from our CTRJJ website. You will also receive a notification when the video of this webinar has been posted to the CTRJJ YouTube page as well. Thank you again, Dr. Carrick, for your wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining today. And please go forth and have a great day.